Little Alberta's childhood couldn't be called carefree. She lived in a mountain village. Every day she descended into the valley where her school was located, and she, like many other children who came from afar, had to return home carrying heavy loads like a pack animal. Every day after school, Alberta went to a small shop where she bought everything necessary for her family and for her elderly neighbour. And when she returned home, the old Mr. Underwood would greet her warmly from afar, noticing the thin figure of the fragile girl carrying her school bag and full shopping bag. "Thank you, my dear, for helping an old man. I can no longer walk such a path on my own. My legs are completely sore," the old Mr. Underwood used to say. "You are a real ray of light in your mother's joyless life, and to me, an old man, you are the first helper. May God bless you, girl." Despite her difficult life, Alberta truly brought joy to everyone who knew her. She loved to sing. Everyone who had heard her gentle voice assured Elizabeth, the girl's mother, that her daughter had a bright future. But Elizabeth often cried, looking at the skinny girl who had to shoulder an impossible burden from a young age. She blamed herself for not being able to give her a carefree and wealthy life. "If it weren't for my husband's death, I wouldn't have been sick so often. My health has been bad in recent years, and I'm ashamed that my daughter has to take care of me." Elizabeth blamed herself. If she were born into a rich family, maybe she would have married a rich man and lived in wealth and prosperity. When Alberta turned 18, she decided to move to the capital. "Mum, you need treatment. I heard that people in big cities can cure almost all diseases. I'll earn money, take you to the city, and definitely get you back on your feet. Meanwhile, Mr. Underwood will look after you, and Aunt Megan's children have grown up, and I'll ask them to buy groceries for you. They are quick kids and will help you with the household chores if needed." The whole village gathered to bid farewell to the lovely girl and wish her a safe journey. Everyone was sure that the hard-working and honest mountain beauty would surely find a good job in the capital, and the neighbours promised to look after her mother. Unfortunately, the big city did not welcome Alberta as warmly as she had hoped. She was a stranger to all these people rushing about their business. She was frightened by the huge flows of cars, spacious squares and avenues. She got lost in the numerous alleys and didn't quite understand whom to turn to for help. Her first attempts to find a job ended in failure. At first, she worked at the market, where she had to carry heavy boxes of vegetables herself, endure rudeness and insults from the loaders, who instead of helping her, kept slacking off. As the cold weather set in, the girl got a job as a salesgirl in a shop. They immediately started hanging all the shortages in the cash register on the new girl, and after a month of work, Alberta not only couldn't get the money she earned, but she also owed a tidy sum to the store owner. The next place she worked was a small cafe. At first, everything was fine, and customers liked the attentive and sweet girl. It seemed that Alberta would finally be able to adapt to the city life in some way. But soon, the owner of the cafe returned from a trip abroad, and at the first meeting, he hinted to the girl that he would only allow her to continue working if she was favourable towards him. Alberta was a clean and decent girl, and the bulky, mature man did not evoke any romantic feelings in her. Unable to withstand his persistent advances, she eventually quit, engulfed by fear and desperation. She was ashamed and embarrassed in front of her neighbours, who believed in her, and in front of her mother, who gave her her last savings to settle in the big city. And now, after several months later, Alberta realised that she could not please her mother with anything, and bitterly cried, sitting on a bench in the park. "Well, why are you making such a damp place here?" someone asked her, and Alberta raised her tear-stained face and saw an elderly man next to her. He compassionately looked at her and seemed ready to help. Did someone offend you? The stranger tried to start a conversation. My name is Mr. Horston, and what's your name? Alberta, the girl said timidly. The old man raised his eyebrows in surprise. Alberta? Rare name. You must not be from here. No, not from here. I came from afar to earn money for my mother's treatment, but nothing works out for me, the girl complained to a stranger. For the first time in a while, having at least some opportunity to speak out, she told him all about her misfortunes. You're despairing too early, my dear. Listen to what I have to tell you. I work as a gardener in a wealthy house. The owner has 5 children and is looking for a hard-working, decent woman to help with the housework. His wife spends more and more time in beauty salons and shops, and my boss, Mr. Gilbert, works a lot. He is from a simple background himself, so he is understanding and kind to people, and he loves his children very much and spends all his spare time with them. Let's try to find a place for you there. Alberta listened to the old man and decided to take a risk for the last time. The house where her new acquaintance led her was indeed large. From the first glance, it was evident that many things were done there specifically for children. Mr. Gilbert built this house before the birth of the babies, immediately planning to make it comfortable for children. That's why half of his garden is taken up by various children's slides and swings. Sometimes I even grumble a little, because I'm supposed to be a gardener, but more often I repair swings. And in the house there's a whole entertainment centre for kids. Don't be surprised that all 5 children are the same age. And don't ask him any questions. It's none of our business how that family live. So, did his wife give birth to all 5 at once? No, she didn't give birth to anyone. She doesn't want to ruin her figure. I'll tell you a secret, but don't gossip. Keep quiet. There is a dark story here. The wife apparently refused to give birth, but Mr. Gilbert wanted a large family. So he turned to surrogate mothers and hired 2 women at once so he could have 2 at once. But they gave birth to 5 for him. One gave birth to twins and the other to triplets. And now he has his own hockey team, we could say. 3 sons and 2 daughters, and he's their goalkeeper. As Alberta listened in surprise to Mr. Houston's story and looked around, a group of happy children ran out of the house, like little sparrows just leaving the nest, chirping and running back and forth. The nanny came out after them. Mrs. Lansbury, called the gardener to the woman. The nanny hurried over to them, separating the quarrelling boys as she went. Mrs. Lansbury, meet Alberta. She's a decent, honest girl who needs work and a place to live. I wonder if Mr. Gilbert will agree to take her. What do you think? Mr. Gilbert left this morning and won't be back until tomorrow. He'll see then. But today you can stay in my room if you have nowhere else to go, offered the nanny. Alberta gratefully agreed and immediately got to know the children. She noticed right away that the children, especially the girls, were really missing their mother. Kate and Lizzie were initially very shy, but they soon opened up to Alberta and started sharing stories from their childhood. The boys, although they tried to act grown up, were still playful and soon swarmed around Alberta from all sides, like ants gathering around a piece of sugar. Just look at them, Mr. Horston laughed. You clearly won them over. Of course, you're not much older than they are. Dad, Dad, the children shouted the next morning when their father returned home from his trip. We have a guest. Her name is so beautiful. Alberta. She's really nice. Can we keep her here? They screamed. Robert Gilbert took the girl's hiring very seriously. He examined her documents and medical records and asked her many questions about her family, her hometown, and her mother, who still lived in a distant village. It's good that you're willing to work and have a motive, but
will you have enough strength for 5 children? Mrs. Lansbury will need to leave soon, and all 5 of these wild kids will fall on you. Think it over 100 times before you agree. As for me, I'm ready to give you a job." But Alberta agreed without hesitation. She really liked the children. They were so lively and sincere, and she felt like they needed her. The girl hadn't seen the house owner yet, but she already understood that the woman was not at all concerned with the children. Susan returned home only a week later. During all that time, she was resting with a friend somewhere in Spain. Susan didn't even approach the children. Her gaze slid over them indifferently, like over furniture. And Alberta didn't arouse any special interest in her either. Some girl from a mountain village couldn't be interesting for a wealthy socialite. "Mr. Halston?" asked Alberta to the old man. "But how did it happen? Mr. Gilbert is such a kind and responsive person. He loves children, but his wife is entirely different. How do they live together?" "Dear, you should not involve yourself in the owner's business. But I wouldn't say they are very close. I have been working here for so long, and they always lived like neighbours. He takes care of the business, house, and children, while she only takes care of herself. Maybe he was in love with her once, got married, and now they just live together. It happens." Alberta sighed, feeling sorry for Mr. Gilbert and the little ones, who received neither love nor affection from the cold, arrogant woman. But no matter how the situation was at the owner's family, Alberta was doing very well. The boss paid her regularly, and now she could send money to her mother regularly. After 6 months of observing Alberta and her work, Mr. Gilbert offered to bring her mother over so that doctors could examine her and make the right diagnosis. Alberta was thrilled. Her dream was about to come true. And soon her beloved mother was really by her side, and after the doctor's examination and treatment, she was feeling much better. Alberta's life finally had a white streak. A good job, kind and nice people around her. Alberta was grateful to the Almighty for granting her such prosperity, tranquility. That was all she wanted. And then something happened that no one expected. Mr. Gilbert disappeared unexpectedly. His car was found in the river. Apparently, he had an accident and flew off the bridge at full speed. His body couldn't be found, and everyone assumed he drowned. Everything changed completely. The joy left the house. The children sat in their room, huddled in a small, constantly crying bundle. Without their dad, they became orphans instantly. Alberta and Mr. Halston knew that Susan didn't need them, but neither the old man nor the girl could imagine that Robert's wife would decide to send the children to an orphanage. "Mr. Halston, we can't allow this to happen," Alberta cried. "How can we let her take away their home, even if she doesn't love them? And Mr. Gilbert might still be found." She decided to talk to Susan, but she was categorical. "I don't care what happens to these children. They were never mine, and their arrival in this house ruined our entire life with Robert. It was his obsession with a big family. I could never understand why he needed it. If you like, take them to yourself. I don't care if they live with you or in an orphanage." "I'm sorry, Susan, it's not my business, but would you still allow the children to stay in the house, at least for their father's sake? You loved him once." "Have you lost your mind? Don't push your luck. Otherwise you'll be kicked out of here, and you won't even have time to pack your things. I am now the mistress of this house, and I repeat, for the last time, I don't need children here." With trembling hands, feeling like a thief, Alberta collected the children's belongings in large bags. The children pressed against her and looked at her with frightened eyes. "Don't be afraid," the girl said confidently, although she was scared to death. Now I will be your mother and won't let anyone hurt you."
"Where are we going?"
asked Tommy with a trembling voice. He was the bravest of the boys, while Ben and James were sniffling and swallowing their tears. "Mr. Halston will shelter us for now. My mother already lives with him. I'll introduce you to her. She's very kind and can make delicious flatbread with goat cheese. You'll definitely like her. We'll all be pleased together, you'll see." Alberta tried to convince the children, but inside she was gripped with fear. Hard times had fallen on everyone. Mr. Halston and Alberta had gone to work for new employers to feed the 5 children. Elizabeth looked after the children and did everything she could to make sure the orphaned children didn't get too sad and cried less often. The operation on her thyroid gland, which was paid by Mr. Gilbert when he was alive, allowed Elizabeth to get back on her feet in time, and now she was happy to be able to help the daughter and 5 children of her missing benefactor. But the world is not without good people, and Alberta encountered them no less often than bad and evil people. So when she tried to obtain guardianship over the children, indifferent and heartless people wanted to take the children away and send them to an orphanage. And at this time, Mr. Halston's nephew, Gordon, appeared in their lives. He held a high post in the police force, had many acquaintances in the guardianship authorities and in other social services. Learning their story, he began to think about how to help Alberta. Meanwhile, one day, Alberta sang at one of the festivals in the park. The owner of a food truck on the food court was struck by her voice and offered Alberta a job as a singer in his restaurant. The girl started to sing there in the evenings, and therefore she could take care of the children during the day. The owner paid the girl well and supplied her family with food. By the way, he wasn't at a loss for it, because he had more visitors to his place. Now many came not only to eat delicious food, but also to listen to Alberta's singing. Having learned her story, people tried to help her in any way they could. Thanks to kind people and Gordon's connections, the children were able to stay with her, and although not very wealthy, they lived happily with their foster mother Alberta and Elizabeth and Mr. Halston as their grandparents. The only thing missing for their complete happiness was a clear understanding of what had happened to Robert Gilbert. In their hearts, they held on to hope that the situation with his disappearance would become clearer. After all, no one had seen him dead. Susan, trying to take possession of her husband's property, did everything possible to have him declared dead as soon as possible. The money available to her only lasted for a short while, and she began to have serious problems. It turns out that the woman had debts and, in addition, a lover. Darryl was a gambler and a junkie who only needed Christine as long as he could get money out of her. It was with him, under the guise of a girlfriend, that she travelled around Europe, and he was the one she gave first her personal money and then her expensive jewellery and fur coats so that he could pay off his creditors. Spoiled by her husband, Susan only now realised what a treasure her husband Robert was. He never denied her anything and did not burden her with any obligations. She never even thought that not all men are as noble and generous as him. Meanwhile, Mr. Gilbert's disappearance, his wife's strange acquaintances, made the investigation take a closer look at Susan. Despite her passionate desire to end it all as soon as possible, Robert's accounts were frozen and his search continued. From time to time, Mr. Halston's nephew visited the elderly man and his unusual family. He told them what he had learned. It turned out that the latest quarrel between Darryl and Susan ended terribly for her. The gambler, who had lost everything, demanded money from his mistress and beat her to near death. Susan's neighbours outraged by the indecent swearing, shouting and noise from her house, called the police. And if the police hadn't appeared in time, Darryl would have beaten her to death in a fit of rage. With a broken jaw and numerous bruises, Susan ended up in the trauma department, and her lover was arrested for causing her serious injuries. However, after recovering a little and losing several front teeth, Susan was forced to go not to a capital dentist but to a courtroom, and not as a victim of her lover's fists, but as his accomplice in a much more serious crime. No one expected such a turn of events. Alberta, who had learned that Susan was in the hospital, had already thought of visiting her when completely unexpected circumstances arose, which made her hair stand on end. It was Mr. Gilbert's wife who had organized the accident for her husband. Her accomplice gave such testimony when he, being in custody, began to have a terrible craving and was ready to do anything just to get a dose. So, what happened to Robert after all? Darryl's confession shed no light on his fate. Nevertheless, one day, Robert himself appeared on the doorstep of Mr. Halston's house, accompanied by Gordon. At first, everyone who saw him was shocked. It was difficult to recognize the once thriving businessman in this exhausted, thickly bearded, greying man, and only his blue eyes in the rays of early kind wrinkles betrayed in him the same Robert whom all his household members were anxious about. After all, he was truly dear to each of them, to old Mr. Halston, to a son, to Elizabeth as a benefactor who had put her on his feet, to the children as the most wonderful and kind father. And what about Alberta? He was dear to the girl as a beloved man, but she was afraid to admit it even to herself. In the evening, when all passions had subsided and the family had put happy little ones to bed, Robert began his story. His story was so wonderful that only those who knew this extraordinary person and understood that the Lord had spared his life for those who loved him could believe in his miraculous salvation. When his car fell off the bridge due to damaged brakes and went underwater, he miraculously managed to escape and get to shore without difficulty. However, he didn't remember anything that happened to him. Head injuries affected his brain activity. For over a year, he was homeless, surviving on odd jobs, without any identification and not knowing anything about himself. A week ago, he was beaten up by a drunkard who tried to steal a few $100s he had earned through hard work. Robert was picked up on the waterfront by an elderly, retired military man who jogged there every morning. He took him to the hospital, and there Robert regained consciousness and realized that his memory had returned. He asked the doctor to inform the nearest police station about him. That's how they met Mr. Halston's nephew. It was now Gordon's turn to tell Robert what had happened after his disappearance. The man had no words to express his gratitude to all kind people for their help, and he was not ashamed of his grateful tears. Nevertheless, Robert admitted that all the misfortunes they had endured were worth it for his children to finally have a real mother in Alberta. It seemed as if God himself had taken this kind girl by the hand and brought her to his house from a distant mountain village. Of course, there was no doubt that they would all continue to live together in Robert's big house. At first, Alberta was a foster mother, and then she became Robert's beloved wife. Yes, it had to happen, and it did. Less than a year passed before Robert asked Elizabeth for her daughter's hand in marriage. In fact, he had fallen in love with the girl from the very first day she appeared in his house. But back then, he tried not to show his feelings, as he was married, and besides, it wasn't in his rules. Now, having obtained a divorce from Susan, he was free,
And finally, the big and rich house was not just a full cup. It was filled with children's laughter, love, mutual care, the smell of baking from Elizabeth, and flowers, carefully grown by Mr. Halston. Not long after that, to the delight of all its inhabitants, the house was filled with the gentle singing of Alberta at the cribs of 2 little girls. Twins she gave birth to her beloved husband on their first wedding anniversary. The older children were thrilled. They had just started their school holidays, and they were vying to help their mother, Alberta. The boys argued amongst themselves about who would stroll the stroller with the little girls along the garden paths. Kate and Lizzie urgently reviewed their girly outfits and dolls, which they were going to give their little sisters. The father of many children, crazed with happiness, was ready to carry his fragile wife in his arms, and she, laughing, refused and suggested that he should more often take his little daughters in his arms and not forget about the older children, who, though feeling grown up, still needed warmth and love. However, there was no shortage of love in their large family, which had suffered so much for its happiness, and when someone among their friends teased Robert, hinting that he had supposedly become a hen-pecked husband to his fragile young wife Alberta, and asked who was in charge in his house, Robert invariably answered sincerely, "Love is the most important thing.